I wanted to make sure to give them a call out. So this is me. I am a software engineer at Message Agency and maintainer of Salesforce module. I've been a Drupal developer about 10 years, and here's basically what we're going to talk about. So, background, challenges, approach, and the solution. And the solution is sort of broken down into 3 points. I'm going to breeze through Nick and Irina's and get into sort of my role. And hopefully there won't be too many questions about the other 2 parts. So background. Cornell University is a large university you've probably heard of. This project mainly focused or started off focusing on their study abroad program. And sort of an overhaul of what was sort of an old legacy program, and a combination of many different data sources and paper trails and manual paperwork and data entry. I work with Message Agency, not Cornell, and Cornell found us through our work with Salesforce and our work with nonprofits and higher eds. We are a B Corp. Does anybody know what a B Corp is? A few people. Okay, so this is triple bottom line. So, we look for mission alignment. We're a for-profit, but we look for mission alignment with our clients. So, folks who are interested in usually nonprofits, foundations, universities, that sort of thing. Folks who are interested in more than just profits. So the project, again, there are so many audiences for this project. Essentially what Cornell wanted to come up with was a clearinghouse for all of their, the long-term goal is for all of their opportunities to be available through one sort of clearinghouse. So whether that's study abroad, which is kind of the first focus, or research fellowships, or internships, or job opportunities, sort of putting that all into a very rich digital experience that still looked amazing and great, like a Cornell website should, as well as making it easy to use. So their audiences, again, are more than just students or prospective students. They have advisors, mentors, administrative staff, each with their own needs and their own sort of journeys. So at the point Message Agency got involved with this project, they had mapped out a lot of that already. They had a very strong vision about what they wanted, what their needs were, which was great. As a consultancy, we don't often get that. A lot of the times we're helping form that, which has its own challenges as well. But they had some high-profile stakeholders, and we're looking for, again, somebody with strong experience in Drupal and Salesforce, which they had identified early on as the sort of technologies that they wanted to go with. So the existing system, again, just for some background, they had outgrown. The existing system was very focused on study abroad, so they had shoehorned some of their other programs into the old system, but it started to make less sense. It was built on old technology. It was 10 years old. It was a proprietary solution. It was not open source. They have, their central IT department. Nick and Irina were managing some of that. They have a dozen other folks in their central IT department. But they were really looking to, level up in terms of the potential and the tools that they were using. They they were able to prolong the life in the existing system, but it got messy over time. The presentation was not sort of Cornell caliber, and this is the front end for the previous system. So this is very much out of the early 2000s sort of style of design. So we started off, Cornell started off with this bowl of noodles. They have so many different technologies, so many websites, and none of them really talking to each other. So it was a lot of administrative overhead to get faculty and program administrators all the things that they needed to do. They may have been in different systems for different programs, and they weren't able to make the connections that they needed to between those to provide with their students with the best experience. It was a lot of overhead for them to run things. So again, the sort of visioning process and the design landed on Drupal because they have strong in-house experience with Drupal. They have a lot of other sites already running Drupal, and they wanted to bring the experience brand under Drupal as well. And the whole, basically the whole university was also moving to Salesforce as one of their systems of record for managing, CRM, constituent relations. In this case, mostly student data, alumni data, and the users for Salesforce are program administrators, faculty, advisors. How many people are super familiar with Salesforce? Passing familiarity with Salesforce? Okay.
Does it?
Other CRMs?
Does it count if I've written this call to Salesforce?
Sure, yeah. That's probably a step ahead of a lot of people. So, just very high level CRM, constituent relationship management. Salesforce is a database, essentially. Razor's Edge is another competitor in that space. It's enterprise level solution that Cornell identified would be a good fit for them and would serve many of their programs. So they're in the process of moving basically everything into Salesforce and connecting it to the systems that are not system of record in Salesforce. So again, Cornell wanted an integration, and they Googled Drupal Salesforce, and we came up because we have, again, about 10, 15 years of experience doing this sort of thing. So what they were able to find was a lot of very strong Drupal firms and a lot of very strong Salesforce firms. What we were able to bring to the table for them was thinking about exactly how those fit together. So leveraging the strengths of both Salesforce and Drupal, and how what are the sort of what are the trade-offs or what are the pitfalls of building a deeply coupled integration between these two systems. So Salesforce is very good at reporting. It's an amazing database engine, and it's very flexible, but it's also very opinionated, which makes it consistent, I guess. And so when you're integrating any system with an opinionated system, Drupal is not opinionated at all. There are 100 different ways to do anything in Drupal, right? Like if I said build a homepage in Drupal, everybody in this room would have a different idea about how to do it, and those would all be equally valid. There's no necessarily right way to do it. In Salesforce, it's kind of the opposite. There are very strong standards that you kind of have to adhere to. So again, when you're integrating these two systems, you have to think about that. So a specific example, In Drupal, we have this idea of cardinality. So you add a field to a content type, and you can say how many of this thing should be attached, right? Like a user might be related to 10 organizations. So you have an organization field on a user record, and you set the cardinality to 10 or to unlimited or something like this. That is a very specific thing to Drupal that doesn't exist in many other systems, specifically in Salesforce. In Salesforce, you would use a join table for that. So when you're integrating the two things, like that's one example of something you have to keep in mind. Another example is email address on your Salesforce contact is not unique. So it's tricky to reconcile that with Drupal users who, as we know, need a unique email address. Salesforce also has downsides, like any system. One, it's very expensive. So if we wanted to have all the students have a full seat in Salesforce, that would be cost prohibitive even for a giant institution like Cornell. What Drupal allows us to do is expose the Salesforce data to Drupal users without giving them a full seat. So we give them a much smaller license for the interactions that they have to do with Salesforce that's about 1,000 times cheaper, and let them do a lot of the interactions directly in Drupal with native Salesforce data. And also Salesforce doesn't really do CMS. I mean, in the same way that Drupal can do CRM, Salesforce can do CMS, which is to say not very well. Has anybody tried to build a CRM in Drupal or used a CRM? There are a couple Contrib-Sphere tools that may work for a modest project, but Salesforce is just sort of industry leading. They have the very strong technology, very strong integrations, and I wouldn't try to build a CMS in Salesforce, but the same way I wouldn't try to build a CRM in Drupal. So we really wanted to leverage the strengths of Drupal as a CMS. So, for example, we're not uploading images into Salesforce, right? We're letting Drupal handle the CMS-y stuff. We try to keep HTML out of Salesforce as much as we can. So again, the study abroad programs really are and let me say what the super cool thing we're able to do with this project, which we're not always able to do, is really iterative development. So, they identified sort of their MVP, and it was around study abroad programs and getting those programs out to students and prospective students and administrators and advisors and iterating from there. So, a lot of times when we're working with a client to put up a new property or replace an existing property, the MVP is basically the whole thing. Like maybe there are a few features down the line that are too expensive or they're going to add later, but the minimum deployment is a significant size. And this is a significant size too, but since the time it's launched about a year and a half ago, they've added and added and added and really taken advantage of their in-house resources to continuously improve the product. So I'm not sure how many opportunities they have beyond study abroad programs at this point, but that was sort of the guinea pigs. So I don't need to read the whole slide, but essentially they designed this kind of Netflix-like browsing experience for their programs and opportunities. And you can see, compared to the before shot, there's no comparison. I mean, it's just it looks like a modern website. It's responsive, it's administrable, it's got really great imagery, and people can find things. They have searches and filters and views and personalization and links between opportunities. And I will, I pulled up the site. I'll poke around that in a little bit. But I really want to get into sort of the underlying structures and how we kind of got there. So again, one of the big principles and one of the refreshing things that Cornell brought to us when we first, like one of the first conversations was about using the right tools for the job and using tools in the way that they're intended to be used to their strengths. And that, again, was very refreshing to hear, rather than saying, like, hey, we have this Drupal site, can we make it do X, Y, Z? Probably. Should we? Maybe, maybe not. But Cornell was on board with that right away. So that was great to hear. And what we were able to do is design a system where the application administrators live in Salesforce. They don't have to go to Drupal. They don't have to worry about what's happening in Drupal. The data might not even be coming from Drupal. It might be coming from some other system. The administrators can live in Salesforce, do all the work they need to there. They have reports. They have dashboards and metrics. All the things they need to run their programs happen in Salesforce. The program administrator is kind of like it's typically like a faculty advisor, right? Like maybe a chaperone, but they have more responsibilities than just chaperoning. The application administrator is more like the bureaucrat side of things, sort of making sure the program runs smoothly, making sure the hotels are booked, or the excursions are booked, or they don't lose a student in who knows where, Southeast Asia, or all these global places they have people going. So the application administrators are in charge of logistics type things, that sort of stuff, but they're also in charge of the nuts and bolts of putting together the applications, which are specific to each program. And in Salesforce, we have another firm that we worked with to build this very powerful, basically web form for Salesforce, which if you've done anything in Salesforce is really impressive, because it's hard to do something like that and to make it look as cool as they did. So the application administrators are putting together checklists and form fields and file fields and requirements and paging those all out and building them in Salesforce once the program administrators have sort of crafted the program definition in Drupal. So again, the program administrators living in Drupal, and they have all the information they need there. They have a heads-up display for their students. They can keep track of all the programs they have running, all the students who are applying or in process of applying, follow up and make sure the students have everything they need, make sure they're on track for their deadlines. And then, of course, last but not least, the applicants themselves. They're actually living in both systems, but they don't know it. They enter through Drupal, they find their program through Drupal, and then they're single signed on, whatever, into Salesforce to fill out the application. And when they're done with that, they go back to Drupal. It looks a little different. It's not exactly the same, but they don't necessarily know because of the way that we have built it with single sign-on. Make sure I didn't miss anything here. So again, Salesforce is the system of record for applications and program data, but Drupal acts as a clearinghouse, consuming data from several sources, actually, including through the Drupal UI, but also from Terra Dotta is a third-party tool where they're tracking some of their additional sort of external programs. So folks who are not necessarily Cornell faculty or involved with Cornell at all, Cornell might have a partnership program with a university abroad, or with a private industry. That stuff goes into Terra Dotta, and then they can bring it in. Drupal administrators can bring those into Drupal and publish those, sort of republish those as native content. And I'm gonna gloss over that part a little bit because that's sort of Irina's bread and butter, but we'll come back to that a little bit down the line. So we already talked about playing to the strengths of each system a little bit. So again, the important questions that we needed to answer up front were about data. Specifically, we did a long session of constructing our build spec and our data schema and figuring out exactly which fields, and for every field, where is it going, where's the source of record. Is it getting synced with Salesforce? Is it getting pushed into Salesforce, or only pulled, or only live in Drupal? So data was a big concern. The application itself was another big concern. Again, most of that was in Salesforce, and of course the presentation was a big priority. Making things look pretty, making them look beautiful, having a great user experience that they weren't ashamed to have associated with the Cornell brand, and a pretty ambitious timeline from the time we spoke with Cornell to the time they deployed the first project. The first version of the product was about 6 months, and they had, like I said, a team of. They have two dedicated. Irina and Nick were dedicated on this project and still working on this project. And they have another sort of front end developer who's part time on this project. And then Message Agency started off as a consultant and I ended up actually writing a few modules and got a bunch of patches back upstream into Salesforce module and a couple into some other contribs. So I think I'm getting ahead of myself though. Let me come back to these slides. So all right, data, application, presentation. So the presentation layer. Again, I'm gonna. This is sort of getting to the under the hood part of things. I'm gonna breeze through the first two parts to get to the Salesforce stuff. Because that's what I know the best. So we were able to use Drupal's API. We were able to use not almost none, but very little custom code. And when we did write custom code, it was to tap into the APIs of Drupal systems. So we're using views APIs to provide some custom fields, custom views plugins and displays. There's leverage of the JSON APIs. We're tapping into some JavaScript stuff to do some cool interactions with views filters and bulk operations. Oh, I think this is out of order. Okay, yeah, I talked about this stuff already. Sorry about that. So the JSON API is called out here. This is a cool use of, very simple, right? Which is basically just drop in this module, and with some config, we were able to expose all this data to as a web service. There's a program actually. One of the programs at Cornell is already using this data. The Cornell Global Programs is running exclusively off of the JSON API of the Experience site. So the JSON API, they could set up basically it exposes an endpoint for all. They've exposed an endpoint for the different content types that they want to expose, so the opportunities, and then that's searchable and customizable, so they could set they could set up, what fields do we want to pull out of this, which, based on which taxonomy. So the global programs is showing, a specific subset of the Cornell opportunities, in its own site, and everything is just sort of works together. And Central IT was not involved in putting this site up at all, right? It's free and open API, so that's cool. Another component, again, Nick's part was the authentication layer. So we did have a compromise here. Originally, what we had wanted to do was set up a single login form for all user types, where the idea was somehow in the background we would attempt to authenticate against one identity provider, and if that didn't work, we would attempt another one. That failed miserably, or I shouldn't say failed miserably. It failed to materialize. And what we end up with is basically somebody comes to the website and you have to choose, do I have a Cornell ID? Click here. No, click here, right? So the user has to choose which IDP they're going to use. Yeah, that's pretty common interface, I think, in other systems where there are multiple authentication options. So for Cornell, IDP is Active Directory, I believe. And we're using simple SAML PHP, which is not so simple to set up. And then for the users who are non-Cornellians, or prospective students or other from other institutions, they're authenticating against Salesforce's SAML sign-on. And they get what's called a community license, which again, you get like 1,000 community licenses for the price of one full Salesforce user seat. So they're registering there, and then both of those end up in either scenario. There, you end up with a Drupal user account, standard type thing. So this is not what it looks like, but this is an example of sort of how the testing of the solution. So this is one of the, which I talked about views and sort of the custom views plugins that we had to do. Let me do this one live actually, because this is cool. If I can find it. So the opportunity, oh boy, okay. No. The opportunity search is what you see here on the right. And we can get into that, or I should say browse. Get into that here. This is all views. This is all, again, there's some custom stuff coming. I mean, there's some custom plugins that we have to do to make this work, but it's all run by views. This apply button is contextual, so if I'm logged in, I have an application in progress, I'll see a my application button there. That's a custom plugin based on the user authentication status. And then what I think is pretty cool is these compare buttons. So this is also views, but this is a views. This is in Drupal 7 it was views bulk operations. I think it's just called bulk operations now. Oh, wow. But so this display is a view that we call when these checkboxes come up. So responding to the VBO is set up on Ajax, and then we respond to the Ajax event to actually render and update this view, and then we can actually compare those. This actually executes the bulk operation, which is to just redirect. You can see up here, this is another view that redirects and takes these contextual arguments, which are the node IDs essentially, and then renders this view. So that was pretty cool. This is a bear to to actually like find all the right JavaScript events and override the right methods. But again, you can see like leaps ahead of what they had previously. Let me see if I can get back to my slides now. Okay, so there'll be more demos, but let's talk about data integration. So this is sort of the basic data flow, and this is all sort of wishy-washy, but primarily user data and opportunities are entering, this is Drupal in the middle here, Experience at Cornell. User data and opportunities are coming into Drupal and then being republished on the JSON API, and they're going back and forth with Salesforce. So, and I say it's a little bit wishy-washy because there are some things about the users that are stored in Salesforce that then may get updated in Salesforce and go back to users, opportunities, vice versa. But primarily, we're bringing the data into Drupal, and then there's application-related things are going back and forth with Salesforce. And then reporting all happens again through Salesforce. One of Salesforce's strong suits is reporting and building reports. They have something similar to views that is kind of a query builder. It's a very cool tool. So, drilling down on the opportunities data a little bit. Again, I was talking earlier about Terra Dotta. There's one source of opportunities. There's a custom. We're consuming a Terra Dotta XML feed to create native Drupal content with those. Direct entry is like literally a Drupal user coming in, filling out a node form. Class roster, I think, is pending or not quite implemented yet. But the idea is similar there to consume, opportunities as native content from a third-party source. So there's a breakdown of the data. This part is Irina's handiwork. So again, I'm glossing over it a little bit. Right. So Terra Dotta is its own, shared system between many institutions globally, and again, Cornell is sort of republishing a lot of those. So why don't they just use Terra Dotta as their, why don't they just use the sort of white label product that Terra Dotta offers? These are the reasons why. Again, I'm breezing through this because I'm not super familiar with it, but I know that Irina explored feeds. She explored the Migrate API, and ended up really just writing a pretty thin custom layer to parse the data from Terra Dotta. The limitations of those other systems were not really, the overhead in sort of overcoming the limitations of Migrate and feeds didn't really justify using those over a custom system. And I think there are a couple special features that she built in, like they can do like they have a schedule where they're importing, but they can also do sort of one-off imports from Terra Dotta with this data. So this is kind of the back-end logic. And I'm again breezing through. I'll publish these online later, but please don't ask me too many questions about this. It works very similar to feeds, right? If anybody's familiar with feeds, which is, I don't know how much traction it has in Drupal 8, but we're consuming the XML files and turning them into native content, and eventually they make their way up to Salesforce. So again, more than just study abroad programs. The native Drupal forms, again, I'm not sure how much work the program administrators are doing for data that they're importing from Terra Dotta, but I know the Cornell administrators are doing a decent amount of work in Drupal natively, as we saw on this donut graph. About a third of their data comes from somebody actually sitting down and working in Drupal in a traditional way, and Central IT has supported those efforts, kind of campus wide. And class roster. I don't really have anything to say about class roster. So Salesforce integrations. Okay, this is where my expertise comes in. So again, pros of Salesforce, industry-leading CRM tools, and lots of integrations with other systems besides Drupal as well that they're using on campus. But it doesn't do CMS, or it does, but it doesn't do it very well, and it's very expensive. So we, get around these by using its powerful integrations. So the sort of 4 different types of Salesforce integrations that I will talk about are around the Salesforce module, which I maintain, the Apex package, which I did not build, but I know enough about, the Apex Web Services, which we're leveraging via some of the tools in the Salesforce module, and the SAML SSO, which I had nothing to do with. So we're talking about, back to the graph here, we're talking about this side of things, the Salesforce application processing side of things, and the user side of things. So users, again, are coming into Drupal, they're authenticating with Salesforce, they are pushing program data back and forth with Salesforce, and they're pushing application data back and forth with Salesforce, and they're, the whole application pipeline is orchestrated through Drupal with big help from Salesforce. So this I have a demo of too. This is a screenshot of this really cool schema builder tool, which is not the point of the screenshot. The point of the screenshot is to show you kind of the complexity of the schema in that they have come up with in Salesforce. So what we're looking at is a diagram of their tables, essentially their data tables, and the relationships between them. And you can see, the program is like the opportunity, like study abroad in Paris, right? The application is like apply for this study abroad in Paris, and then to build the application, they have all of these other steps. They have checklists. They have emergency information. They have requirements. They have a set of application types that define sort of the general outline for any given application. Application questions. The student record itself. The program is offered in specific terms, and those terms are related via this program term offering join table. And then we have the actual applicant, which is a separate record from the student, which is a separate record from the contact. So everything is very, very well normalized in Salesforce. And you can see on the left here, we're looking at this tiny, tiny subset of all the data they have in Salesforce. I mean, they have a separate table for city. They have a separate table for country. Those join together to create a location. The locations are then joined to each program term. So I just show this to get at some of the complexity. Again, not something that I put together, all of this schema, but this is what we're working with. And also that's a really cool tool. I didn't show like dragging everything around, but you can drag these tables around. You can jump to like the table definition here and edit it. You can show and hide other tables, and they automatically like get linked up, and you can auto lay them out here, and super cool tool. It's just fun to mess with. But anyway, the Salesforce module. What is it? Does anybody use this module? Okay, great. Essentially, there's a few different layers. We have the base layer is a REST API client, so it's a wrapper for all the REST APIs that Salesforce exposes. The next layer is a mapping platform. So, my Drupal user email maps to my Salesforce contact email. My Drupal user first name maps to my Salesforce contact first name, et cetera, et cetera. And then the layer on top of that, well, maybe there's a layer missing here. The layer on top of that is the actual data orchestration. So pushing the data to Salesforce, pulling data from Salesforce, making sure everything goes smoothly there. And everything is extensible via Drupal plugins and entity API and event APIs. And so for the Cornell project, we let me make sure I'm not missing anything here again. We have 9 different Salesforce tables, 4 different Drupal entity types, close to a dozen different mappings. A bunch of these numbers are out of date too, because we have more events now that we're subscribing, and all our business logic is implemented via that events layer, and more than a dozen patches back up to Drupal.org out of this project. And I don't know if I'm going to have enough time to get into the code, but if you are interested in that, come see me after. The planning for this is again one of the spreadsheets that went into planning the Drupal build and the integration with Salesforce. So each of these rows is one, or some of the fields have multiple rows, but each is one Drupal field, and then all of the sort of notes, where it maps in Salesforce, which tables, which fields. And then exactly how, or special considerations. And this was like a probably 6 weeks to 2 month process of meetings and literally line by line going through and making sure everything is very well spec'd out. So, as much as they have an iterative process, it was not at the expense of planning and documentation. So I have a demo of this too. This is a screenshot of the mapping interface for the Salesforce module, and what we're looking at here are the list of mappings, and then each of these mappings defines a relationship again between a Drupal entity and a Salesforce object or tables, kind of interchangeable, and then there's a sort of metadata about the mapping, and then the mapping fields. The fields, again, you have Drupal properties on the left, Salesforce to the right of that, and then you can say which direction, whatever, and then the operations are just form UI. So you can see, well, this doesn't have very many fields. But that's essentially how it works, and you can add different field types. The field types are defined by a plugin system, so you can add your own. And then the properties are things like when do we care about synchronizing this data? Are we pulling from Salesforce? Are we pushing to Salesforce? What are the settings for each of those things? And you can pick all your different Drupal content types here. For some reason you want to map blocks or flags, or anything that uses Entity API and Fields API can be mapped from between Drupal and Salesforce. Yeah, go ahead.
Web form doesn't, right?
It does. It does. There is the Salesforce module now supports web form in a way that is so web form, because web form doesn't use fields, right?
Yeah.
The actual fields of the web form are defined in a config YAML that is not fields, but it's actually a pretty thin layer to just kind of expose those to the mapping based on that YAML config. it's a little bit like once you set up that mapping with a web form, you kind of locked yourself in, because you can go then and change the web form fields, and there's not a great API for Salesforce to respond to that, because it's not like you could break the mapping very easily, right? Especially if your web admins are not super savvy, or if they don't know anything about the Salesforce integration. But it's there, it works. There's also, if you're familiar with web to case or web to lead, there's a simpler integration layer with Salesforce. That's basically, it's a form that posts directly to a Salesforce web endpoint. There's an integration with web forms that works through that as well. Good question, thank you. Let me keep trucking here. We just saw this. Let me switch back to the live part here, because I want to show you. Pretend you didn't see that. Is this a program? Okay, so where is my mouse? There we go. Let me go back to the overview. So basically everything in the content well here in the overview section is Drupal only content, down to the apply button. The apply button is a custom widget that is coupled to the program status. Everything on the right and the left is coming from Salesforce, or the Salesforce is the database of record for all of this data, and it's synchronized, it's duplicated in Drupal essentially, and reposted here. So, if a program administrator comes and changes some of this data, that gets sent up to Salesforce, and vice versa if it's changed in Salesforce. Obviously, this map is not stored in Salesforce, but the location data is stored in Salesforce and then translated using Google whatever API. So again, back to the opportunities listing page. All of this besides the image is in sales, and the teaser here again is driven from Salesforce data, or I should say, driven from Drupal data that's synchronized with Salesforce as a source of record.
Is that are you making some call through Ajax to get the data on demand, or is it?
No.
Is it stored?
For some of them we are, yes. And that's a great segue because we are through the Apex package. So the Salesforce module works by duplicating the data, essentially, which is great for, for things that can be cached, or, it doesn't matter if they're a little stale. There's a asynchronous process that pushes and pulls that data to synchronize it. For things like student applications where they need to see almost real time or as close to real time data as possible, we're using this Apex package, and also to eliminate some of the sort of data liability. We don't necessarily want to have all the CRM data in Drupal. We don't want to synchronize all of that. That's why we're using Salesforce, right? If we just synchronize everything and replicate it, that kind of undermines the purpose a little bit. So what we do with this Apex package is black box a lot of the business logic around, what are the students' current applications, where are they applying? It's a data structure that we defined during that build specking process. But basically, Drupal the user logs into Drupal. We supply an ID to Salesforce to this. I'm sorry, that's not the Apex package. That's the custom web services. The Apex package is. I'll come back to that. The custom web services, but the Apex package runs this form. So when a user clicks on the apply button, they go to Salesforce, right? If it's a Cornell native program, they go to Salesforce. Some of the programs, like I said, the applications are off-site because they're not Cornell programs. But this screen right here is Salesforce. So this is a Visualforce, user-facing page. The user has authenticated either via Active Directory or via Salesforce IDP, and this whole thing is built from that crazy set of tables that you saw earlier, and displayed, and then the data is
Were
collected.
you using one of the third-party Salesforce Forms plugins like FormStack or Form Assembly?
Nope.
No, you guys were rolling your own.
I didn't, but yeah, our Salesforce partner did.
Yeah.
And they, I'm not sure all the reasons for that, but I know, part of it was the very specific needs that they had, and, some of the limitations of those systems around, things like branding and things like the requirements and the very tight coupling with the other program data. So again, all of this feeds directly into native Salesforce content in real time, and when the user fills out this form, this is what the administrator sees, but the user comes back to Drupal essentially and hits a custom endpoint that tells Drupal, refresh the data. Something just happened in Salesforce, like do a pull or whatever. So super cool feature. There could probably be a whole presentation on that, but probably at a Salesforce conference. So the Apex Web Services, this is what you're referring to, or what I was trying to segue into, are this sort of black box thing. So the REST API client in the Salesforce module is the same, it's the same REST API that we can use Apex, which is Salesforce's custom JavaScript-y programming language. We use Apex to expose a web service on the Salesforce side, and then we can use the same access token. We just provide a new endpoint to the REST API client, and tell it where to look, basically, and we have an Apex consumer for our custom web service in 3 lines of code. What do we do with that data? It takes more than 3 lines, but essentially, again, when the user logs in or when they hit that custom endpoint to refresh their data, we send the user ID off to Salesforce, and Salesforce sends us back a data structure, packet with all the information we need for that user. So everything on this page, this looks kind of like a view. It's not at all. This page is run. This is kind of like a headless type thing, except it's basically we render a set of JSON data that we get from that Salesforce endpoint, and then in the JavaScript layer, we sort of put everything together here. There's a twig file involved. So, the user can see their approved applications, applications in progress, the status of all those applications, deadlines. And Drupal, again, because it's this black box, Drupal doesn't care about how all that stuff gets put together. None of this data lives natively in Drupal. It's sort of just cached on the user, for that session or, until it's expired, and then we just throw it up here, right? If the logic changes on the Salesforce side, they manage it once there, and we don't have to worry about it in Drupal. If they get kicked out of one of these programs, it disappears from there, and Drupal is none the wiser. And then there's a couple links like commit and withdraw. Those are links off to those actually I think those are wrappers for other web services. So the request goes through Drupal, triggers a Salesforce web service, and then changes the status there, refreshes their application cache on the Drupal side.
Was that for the applicant or the person administrating?
Yeah, good question. This is the student dashboard. It's unlikely they're going to be applying for all these programs. I don't know. Maybe they will. I don't know. They're very ambitious. The administrator, the program admin looks like this. So for each of her programs, she can see, the list of applicants. She can see their statuses. She has a link to get a hold of them if she needs to, give them a little poke, remind them to finish their application. And again, the same deal here. This is all just JSON data that we've got from the web service, and essentially just passing it right through to the display layer. And good. This is good timing. We'll have some time for questions. The SAML SSO we kind of talked about already. I don't really have much more to say about, but it's another integration point here. Salesforce can serve as an identity provider. And Drupal is the service provider, right? So Drupal provides the service of letting people log in, and Salesforce has their identity. And again, saves on licensing fees. So key takeaways, again, using tools for their strengths, and iteration, and just continuously improving. But again, not at the sacrifice of documentation and planning. And yeah, I think we have a few minutes left if there are more questions.
Do they integrate with any marketing automation tool and pull data to and from?
Maybe, I don't know. There's a Rebecca Joffrey and Shannon Osborne are the two sort of leaders of this project internally at Cornell, and Rebecca's on the marketing arm, so she might know that. She's been doing like the Salesforce circuit and higher ed conference circuits with a similar presentation from kind of the higher level, marketing side of things. So I might look there. I wasn't involved with any of that. I know Salesforce has a marketing cloud, which does marketing automation, but it's kind of one of the Salesforce's acquisitions that never got fully folded. It's got its own API. It doesn't work with Salesforce module API. It's not the same endpoints. It's not the same authentication system. Yeah.
I know at some point the REST API in Salesforce wasn't complete. Did they enhance it? I remember at some point the Salesforce module had to use the SOAP integration for certain functionality.
Yeah. So the REST API versus SOAP API. So there's still a few features missing in like maybe 2 years ago or so. Whenever we moved to 8x, basically we just ditched SOAP API because it's a pain. It's a huge pain. And the REST API is good enough. It doesn't do so. There are the main couple things we get from SOAP API that we don't get from REST API are large record sets. So with SOAP API, you could push. Was it push? I think you could push like 2,000 records at a time. So and Salesforce API does have a limited quota, so earlier versions we had this complex system where we would queue up and batch these records to push and pull, but honestly it was never worth the overhead. Even Cornell is not anywhere near their quota. So if you're really bumping up against like the 50,000 API calls a day, that's probably a good problem, or you need to sort of re-architect your solution. Because the way that we get around a lot of those API limitations is just with caching, temporary caching. Like I said, user logs in, they get fresh data immediately if they need to see something immediately, and then that data is probably good for 10, 15 minutes at least. Maybe somebody's changing something on the Salesforce side and they don't see it right away. How often does it actually happen though? Not enough to justify, this expensive SOAP API and a very large asynchronous like queue handling and reconciling layer. But yeah, no, they have been adding features to the REST API. It's much better supported than the SOAP API. And the SOAP, there was also a SOAP SDK package that has not been supported for like 5 or 6 years from Salesforce. Okay. Although that said, there is a SOAP module in the Salesforce module if for some reason you need to use SOAP.
On the applicant status page, did you say you were custom processing the API feed, your custom API feed? So on that page, that is a custom rendering, right? You're not using views for that?
Correct.
Did you look at doing a custom data provider for views?
I don't know. I don't know if we did. I know Irina is primarily a JavaScript programmer, so she was very comfortable just taking a JSON feed and popping this together. So I don't know if she did or if she said, it's not really worth it. There are a few things that would definitely be tricky on views, like the status bar. So,
Right.
yeah, I don't think she did look at it. Any other questions? Okey-doke. All right, let's have lunch.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you all.
It's like, it's funny that it's their work played out.